Welcome to Industrial Risk Beyond the Blueprint. I'm your host, Jowanza Joseph, and today we're diving deep into the world of practical risk management with someone who's literally written the book on it, multiple books actually, Dr. David Hillson, known globally as the Risk Doctor. He has spent decades making risk management accessible and actionable for organizations worldwide. With over 15 books, 140 briefings, and work across 60 countries in sectors from energy to mining to infrastructure, he's been and seen every kind of risk challenge you can imagine, and probably a few that you haven't. Dr. Hillson built his reputation on giving risk professionals the tools they actually need to make better decisions, communicate more effectively, and build cultures where risk awareness leads to real action. And so I'm happy to welcome him today. And to jump in, Dr. Hillson, what's the biggest misconception about risk you see in industry today?
Well, Jowanza, thank you very much for your warm welcome. And it's a privilege and honor to contribute to this podcast series. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. The biggest misconception, I think, is when people say risk management, it's not my job. It's not for me. There's someone else will take care of that. We have a risk manager or a risk specialist or someone else deals with risk. And I don't really need to worry about it. My perspective is that managing risk is a life skill. It's how we stay alive from day to day. It's how the human species is still on the planet. And risk management is everybody's job. So risk is something that affects the things that matter to me, and I need to manage my risks. So to say risk management is not my job, big mistake. Yes, it is.
Yeah, I can't agree more as someone who works making software in this space and trying to help companies manage their risk that is the biggest problem when there's not a culture that's kind of widely spread across the organization that everyone looks at risk management as their job. What drew you into risk management? Is this something that you were born wanting to do, or how did you get into this field?
Well, I've been involved in risk management since the mid 1980s, probably before you were born, I think. So in the days when I was involved in risk management, there was no official risk management role or job. It wasn't a job title. It wasn't a career. So I got into it by accident. I was in a major engineering company in the UK as a project manager. One of our projects, which was multi-million international contract, was really in trouble. It had no plan to complete. It had lots of technical issues. And the bosses of the company had heard about risk management from the oil and gas sector and thought just maybe it might rescue the project. And so asked me if I would look into it and maybe just try borrowing some of those techniques and applying them on our really troubled project. And so I did. I got to learn a little bit about risk management fairly quickly and tried out. It worked. We rescued the project. It came in successfully and delighted the client, met all the objectives, was on time and on budget in the end. And so the bosses said, well, that was good. You can do that again. And so I got the job of introducing risk management across all of our projects, ultimately across the whole business, advising the board. And I discovered that I really liked it. I really enjoyed it and I was quite good at it. So it was entirely by accident. I was dropped into it because I was a junior project manager, just had to do as I was told. And when we found that it worked, then I carried on.
Wonderful. Yeah, you have been working in it longer than I've been alive. So that's 1987. So I assume that you started before then. Being in this field for so long, what keeps you passionate about it? What's kept you interested over these many decades?
Yeah, you're supposed to say you don't look that old, by the way. Just just a little tip, to keep your partners happy. I think what keeps me passionate about it is it really makes a difference. Risk management
Yeah.
really works, and it helps us to focus on the things that we weren't focusing on, to see things that we hadn't previously seen, to do things that we weren't previously doing, and really succeed, whether it be in our projects or in our business, in our operations, in our personal lives, and our personal objectives and goals, in our families and our clubs and our organizations, right across the board. Having something which will allow you to see things you hadn't previously seen is really, really useful. I call it a risk radar, kind of scans the future and sees what's out there coming towards you. And what really makes me passionate is that it helps organizations, projects, individuals, teams achieve their goals better, more effectively, working faster, smarter, cheaper, and getting to the end in the best possible way. And it's just a delight for me as a consultant to see my clients doing the things they need to do, but doing them better. And there's less stress. People sleep better at night. And it's just a nice technique to help people achieve their goals.
That's wonderful, and to just see that continue to bring value to you and to your clients over this many decades is really powerful. And, as you've worked in this space and, seen the evolving risks and things that have changed over the decades, how has your perspective about risk management changed over these many decades?
Yeah, a lot, a lot. And mostly because I've had the privilege of working with some really, really bright people, some clever people, some thought leaders, and some innovators who have come into the risk management field. And together we've kind of grown the discipline and seen it evolve and develop. Right at the very beginning, I was entirely focused on process. You identify your risks and you prioritize them and you work out your responses and then you report it and then you do it again. And fairly early on, I discovered that process isn't enough and that it's people who manage risk, not processes. So seeing that whole people side and plugging that into the process, understanding about psychology, about bias, about decision making, about our personal goals, explicit and implicit, all of that I found really, really helpful to add to the process. So people plus process has been a real kind of dual focus as we've gone forward in risk management over the last little while. And then also seeing risk management expand beyond the technical realm. So it used to be about making sure our projects delivered on time, on budget, on scope, quality and those sorts of things. And now seeing risk management applied in lots of other sectors from governments and major organizations, charities, churches, tennis clubs, families. It's really been interesting to see how the scope has broadened. And now we're talking about things like cyber risk and artificial intelligence and big data, which we never dreamt of before. And just recently, the United Nations has recognized a new kind of risk that they're calling existential risk, the risk to
Essential.
the human race as a whole. So, the scope of risk management has grown much, much bigger from time and cost to quality on projects to really encompassing the whole human experience. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I find that fascinating as well. And you talked a little bit about the people aspect of it and the process aspect of it, and really the kind of symbiotic nature of working together and that producing the best outcomes as far as it goes when it comes to managing risk. And when you work with organizations, what are some common mistakes that organizations make when they're thinking about risk management? Is it still around this people process area, or maybe there's some other areas that are common that you see as mistake areas when implementing risk management?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake, misconception about risk that people have, apart from, it's not my job, which we talked about earlier, is to think that all risk is bad. That risk is a threat, that we need to protect ourselves and preserve ourselves and kind of, make life easier because risk is bad, it's out to get us and it's always going to be threatening us. And that's just not true. That risk actually also includes, and we'll come to this when we perhaps talk a little bit about definitions and what risk really is, but risk includes upside as well as downside. There are good risks, which they're uncertainties that could help you achieve your goals, just as much as there are downside risks, threats, uncertainties that could prevent you achieving your goals. And I think that the biggest misconception or mistake that I see still in organizations is to just focus on the bad things, just focus on the downside and protecting themselves and being very, very careful. And of course, there are bad things out there, and we do need to find them and prioritize them and protect ourselves to minimize and avoid them and so on. But there are also uncertainties that we could embrace, which would help us to innovate, help us to be creative, help us to do things in a different way that we've never done before because of the uncertain possibilities of upside, things that would help us achieve our goals faster and cheaper and more effectively, and maybe break into new areas. And all innovation actually comes from embracing uncertainty. So I think to see that more broadly in an organizational sense, is really, really important. And we've been talking about this in the risk world for about the last 25 years, around the turn of the millennium, thinking about risk being good as well as bad and opportunity as well as threat, that risk is a double-sided concept. And what we're trying to do in risk management is maximize our opportunities and minimize our threats at the same time in order to optimize achievement of our goals and objectives. And still I see, although we've been talking about it for so long and the benefits are so clear, organizations are still just focusing on the downside. And the problem with that is that it always leads to failure because you always miss something. And so the question is, if you're looking at bad things and protecting yourself against bad things, you will fail. It's just how badly will you fail? If you don't also look for upside ways of working faster and smarter, of improving your performance, by embracing and exploiting uncertainty, then you get the kind of swings and roundabouts effect if you can do that. So I think it's really important that we keep a broad view of risk and not just focus on just the downside or just on technical risks. We need to see risk within that broad canvas.
That's quite insightful because I'm the CEO of a startup, and a lot of my canvas of which I have to view the world is through this kind of risk reward vision, right? Because everything I do has upside and downside, and some of those downsides can be quite tragic or dramatic, right? I can make a mistake that will wipe out all of our cash balance and then the company is over. But then without taking those risks, we don't have the upside either. So I think what you were saying really resonated with me and the position I'm in, but I do also see that in larger organizations where there's so much focus on risk mitigation, risk transference, and not so much of this holistic risk, kind of holistic risk view as you've mentioned.
Yeah, it's been one of the things that I've focused on really for the last 25 years, trying to make sure that people don't miss the opportunities because they're focusing on the threats. And entrepreneurs get it. You
Yep.
recognize you have to take risks in order to do something different, to get a competitive edge, to create something that's never been created before. You have to step out of your comfort zone, which
Yep.
means being uncomfortable. But you do that in order to create value, in order to be innovative, in order to be competitive, and to do something fresh. And without that, it's just not possible. And what we need to see is that entrepreneurial spirit taken into operations and into the way that we do our businesses from the top to the bottom, so that we're all entrepreneurs in our own particular area of focus.
I completely agree. And thinking about all of the framework we've talked about so far and what makes risk management special, I wanted to kind of maybe go back to a little bit of a simple or practical example. So if you can maybe share a story where like a simple risk practice made a big difference in an organization to kind of frame maybe the next couple questions that we'll go through.
Sure. I mean, there's so many examples. I've been doing this, as I said, for 35 years and in 60 different countries, every continent except the Antarctic, every industry type, large and small. So lots of war stories. A simple example, you might be interested in something I did with NASA on the mission to Mars, which was quite interesting. As part of the plan to get to Mars, NASA wants to build a base station on the moon. So we're going to get to the moon, settle there, and then use that as a jumping off point to get to Mars because the gravity's less and we're closer and we don't have Earth orbit and all of those things. So they were having real trouble on the Constellation program, an early version of the manned mission to Mars, and had real problems thinking about how to build a base station on the moon because it's such a risky thing to do. It can go wrong in so many ways and kill astronauts and waste money and all of those things. So I was invited, actually, it was in Virginia Beach, I think, to the NASA headquarters down there, to meet with their technology development program and to talk to them about how they could move forward. They'd really kind of locked themselves into a corner because everything was really bad and they couldn't see how they could possibly move forward. And so we introduced this idea of opportunities, of upside thinking, and they'd not really thought about it that way before. We flipped it on its head. And I ran something which I called a good luck workshop, where you imagine that I played the part of a fairy godmother. So, in the children's stories, the fairy godmother comes along and she says, I grant you 3 wishes. What would you like? And they wish for good things and the good things happen. And I said to the NASA management team, so I'm your fairy godmother. I grant you 3 wishes for building a base station on the moon. What would they be? And they thought it was crazy and we had a little bit of fun with it. But we came out with 8 ideas that could help them to do what they had to do. And I won't go into the details here, but just by flipping the workshop, a risk brainstorm is usually about thinking of all the ways things that could go wrong. We started thinking about all the ways that it could go right. And some of them were stupid ideas, like, we get to the moon and we discover that aliens have already built a base station on the moon and we can just move in. Wouldn't that be great? I mean, it's a stupid idea. You think about where there might be a place that humans could live in a harsh environment where they couldn't live outside. And that's something that already exists that maybe we could use as a model and put that on the moon. And of course, such things do exist on Earth at the bottom of the ocean. So we do have places where people live in an environment which is entirely unsurvivable at the bottom of the ocean, and you can live there. We can take some of the design ideas from a bubble at the bottom of the ocean and put it up on the moon. And so that idea of a crazy sort of fairy godmother, a lucky wish, turned into a real prospect that they could develop and work on. And so the simple idea of having a good luck workshop or a fairy godmother workshop or a in your dreams workshop, nightmares and wonderful dreams, those sorts of things transformed the way that they thought about the issue they were trying to solve and gave them some ways forward that they hadn't previously thought of.
Yeah, I love that example, and like that these workshops and thought exercises help you to again really think outside the box to maybe get a different perspective on the risks. And I know in your career you've got many frameworks that you've introduced, and one of the ones I wanted to ask you about is the 7 questions approach. Could you describe that and how that helps teams when dealing with
Sure. A lot of people think that risk management is a highly sort of technical discipline. You've got to think about probability theory and you've got to think about, all sorts of sort of wild concepts. My motto, the Risk Doctor motto, is understand profoundly so you can explain simply. So the idea is I do all the deep thinking and my colleagues, the thought leaders are working through these things. But if I expose all of that kind of thinking and the philosophy and the concepts, it's hard to understand. So the real job of an expert is to take all that deep thinking and to translate into something simple that anybody could understand and use. So the risk process I distilled down into a set of standard kind of common sense questions that everybody would ask. And so there are 7 questions which basically embody the risk management framework, but it doesn't mention risk anywhere. So the first thing is, what are we trying to do? That's an obvious question. What are you trying to do? What that actually is about is defining objectives, defining the things that are at risk. Because risk doesn't exist in a vacuum. Something has to be at risk that we're trying to do. And we're looking for the uncertainties that could affect that. So first of all, what am I trying to do? And then what could affect me in doing that? So the first one is objective setting. The second one is actually risk identification. But what you're thinking about is what might happen that relates to that goal. So it's identifying the risks, but just thinking about it as, well, what might happen? And then not all those things are equally important. Some will be more important than others. So the third question is, well, which are the big ones? What am I trying to do? What might affect me? Which are the big ones? That's prioritization or risk assessment. And then you think, well, once I know what the big ones are, the worst possible threats and the best possible opportunities, well, what are you going to do about it? So what could affect me? What am I trying to do? What could affect me? Which are the big ones? What could I do? That's risk response planning. And then you do it and you say, well, okay, I did it. Did that work? That's risk review. And then you say, well, what's changed? And that's risk updates. And then you say, who should I tell? Who needs to know about that? And that's risk communication. So simple questions that kind of flow through in a common sense way actually create the risk management process. So you don't need to remember, now I need to run a workshop, then I need to produce a risk database, then I need to do some kind of prioritization exercise, then I do Monte Carlo simulation, then I write reports. You're asking the question which those things come out of. So what am I trying to do? What could affect me? Which are the big ones? What could I do about it? When you've done it, did that work? What's changed and who shall I tell? Really simple questions, but they kind of create a risk management process without really thinking about it because each previous question leads to the next question.
Oh, that's a quite an elegant framework. You said it was simple, but as you talked through it, and I read it kind of previous to this doing this podcast, is just quite elegant in the way that it captures all the real questions at hand when dealing with a scenario or a problem where you do want to look at it through risk management. And I think it's
Yeah.
a good starting point, right, for building a culture and a process around risk. And not only a starting point, I think it can be so expansive in the way that people can apply it. It's just a really, really impressive framework,
Well, it
I would
also
say.
helps to demystify the risk process. So
Mhm.
if you say to your team, we're going to run a risk workshop, and they're going, well, what's the point of that? What am I supposed to do? How do I prepare? What sort of things are we going to talk about? So if you say that, you immediately have some jargon, and there's the risk of the threat of being misunderstood. If you say, look, we know what we're trying to do in our project. We're going to get together and talk about what could affect us. Actually, that's a risk workshop. And then we're going to work out which are the big ones. It's risk assessment. But you don't need to tell them that. You just say, okay, we're going to get together. We know what we're trying to do, what could affect us, and work out which are the big ones. And then they'll come and they know what's expected. They're thinking about things that matter. And then they're going to try and work out, which ones matter most. And you've demystified by taking the jargon out. You don't say the risk word, but it is in fact a risk workshop by any other name. And that helps, it encourages people to participate without feeling excluded by the jargon or by some imagined kind of technical difficulty.
Yeah, that when you were talking about the jargon and how it can be a limiting factor or get into the way of understanding, risk. I have two children, so I've got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and sometimes I will explain something to them with so much jargon, and then they will ask questions back. What does that mean? What does that mean? And when I translate it down into something that is just not jargon, they completely understand it. And it's sometimes we just use these jargon words as crutches and try to put this technical sophistication onto a concept that doesn't necessarily need it. And if you can calm the language down, make it a little bit plainer, then you can have some of the same outcomes that you would want anyway.
Exactly. You don't want to dumb it down. I mean, the
Yep.
richness is all still there, but you're just using language that is accessible to everybody. And you don't need to have any kind of risk training to understand what we're trying to do in the risk process. Risk is uncertainty that matters. It's all about uncertainty, but not any uncertainties, the ones that matter. What we want to find is the ones that matter most. And it's really very straightforward. And the language is key, I think.
I completely agree. And I guess on the jargon topic, there is a phrase called risk appetite. And when thinking about risk management and managing risk, could you describe what we mean by risk appetite and how that's used in the context of a wider risk plan?
Sure. It's really important, isn't it? And risk appetite is absolutely a piece of jargon
Yep.
that it has lots of different meanings, or people perceive it in different ways. So I've written a book. There's a book called A Short Guide to Risk Appetite, and it's one of those things that I try to demystify and make simple by starting with the idea of physical appetite. So, it's actually very nearly my supper time here. My wife's busy cooking in the kitchen. I can smell some of those lovely things coming up, and I feel hungry. But if you ask me the question, how hungry are you? How do I answer the question? Like, very, not very? What does that mean? On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm an 8. On a high, medium, and low, I'm kind of medium-ish. How do we quantify appetite? Appetite is an internal sort of drive to satisfy a hunger, satisfy a need. And the same is true with risk appetite. The problem with risk appetite is it's an internal drive to take risk in order to meet a need. And it's kind of intangible. So it's a drive, but if I wanted to try and put some units to my hunger, I might say I could eat a big steak and lots of ice cream and a glass of wine. That's how my hunger is. Or I might say, I just fancy a light salad and I don't need a dessert and a glass of water is fine. I'm using the units of food to express an internal drive called hunger or appetite. The same is true with risk appetite. We use the units of risk to express that drive to take risk to achieve goals. So risk appetite is an internal drive to take risk in order to achieve goals. How hungry am I for risk? And I use the units of risk to describe that internal drive. So I might say, I'm prepared to put $1 million on the line in order to achieve this goal. And if I lose the $1 million, that's fine. At least I tried. Or you might say, $1 million? Really? That would kill me. If I lost $1 million, I don't know what I'd do. I'd be destitute. I couldn't cope. So I'd be prepared to put $1,000 or maybe $5,000 on the line in order to achieve this. We're using the dollars to express our appetite for taking risk in that situation to achieve those goals. So I would talk about risk thresholds as being expressions of risk appetite, because risk appetite is internal and risk thresholds are outside and measurable. And we can actually say this much money, this much time, these many faults, these many complaints. These are the sorts of things I'm prepared to take in order to get where I need to go. More than that is too much. Under that is okay. But those are measurable thresholds. So we're answering the question, how much risk is too much risk? And that's really hard to answer in the abstract. But by putting thresholds on it, then we can begin to get something that's usable in the real world.
Yeah, that's quite insightful. I had a question for you, kind of a follow up is even with this abstraction away from the appetite to maybe something measurable, like the cost of doing that activity or the time that it takes in your consulting and working as a risk professional, have you found that even that quantification is difficult when you really put when push comes to shove and say, hey, we're going to quantify our appetite to do this? You find organizations struggle with understanding what that cost is, or even what the interplay between multiple costs might be around a specific risk.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're going back now to the language question. So
Yep.
you don't say you need to express your risk appetite in terms of measurable risk thresholds. They're going to go, whoa, all those words, I heard the words and, I can tell you what each one means, but together I have no idea what you just said. So you need to talk about budgets and you need to talk about share price, the things that matter to the people you're talking to. So if they're decision makers, they're things at this level. If they're engineers, they're things at this level. You need to use their language to say how much, at what point would you cancel the project? At what point would you close the company? At what point would you resign in shame? Where is the boundary that says, this is just too much. I couldn't cope with that. Okay, well, that's unacceptable. We're not going to get there, but where is your kind of safety net before that? So it's like, you've got a cliff edge. You don't want to fall off the cliff edge. So you put a fence up, but you don't put the fence on the cliff edge. You put the fence before the cliff edge. And then before the fence, you put a warning sign. And these things are our thresholds that say, there's a cliff ahead. You don't want to fall off here. Read the sign. If you didn't read the sign, stop at the fence. If you climb over the fence, well, then you're at your own risk. And the same is true with innovation or with projects or with entrepreneurship. There's a cliff edge which will kill you or kill the company, or it would do some irreparable damage. You don't want to be there, but what can you do to stop yourself getting there? And so your risk thresholds are the things that will protect you from going over the edge. And so you use that kind of language rather than the language of risk thresholds and risk tolerance and risk appetite and risk preferences and all those sort of technical terms in order to make it real for people.
Yeah, that makes it, yeah, so salient, and then also it gives you a framework that you can quickly translate to and get out of the jargon, and kind of thinking
Uh-huh.
about this layer of abstraction and adding a framework for someone who's tasked with really quantifying these risks, quantifying the appetite for it. How do leaders get this kind of training? Is this standard training for someone who's a chief risk officer? Is this training that maybe you offer as someone who's worked in as a consultant in risk management? How do leaders get this kind of ability to communicate, translate, and bring this kind of tangibility to these issues?
Yeah, there's a lot more resources out there than there were when I started, when we really had nothing. So, of course, there are courses and briefings and workshops and seminars and those sorts of things. There's books and there's articles, there's video channels, and there are coaches and mentors and consultants, and all those resources are available. But you can't beat experience. And so we all actually have our own experience when we're leaders of organizations or leaders of teams or leaders of projects. We try things and they work or they don't work. And one of the big mistakes we make is failing to learn from experience and going back and reviewing. I've got this scar here. How did I get this scar? I remember, yeah, I got too close to the edge and I got cut. Um, well, I'm not going to do that again because the scar reminds me. We don't look at our scars often enough. Or, I've got this award on my wall behind me. That was really great. How did I get that? What was I doing that actually got me? I've got to do that again. So we need to learn from our good and bad experiences. And I think you can go to all of the seminars and read all the books, but nothing beats experience, your own scars and your own rewards, to actually help you learn.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think the experience that you get through just being in the trenches and learning is, you can't trade that for reading a book or watching a video on YouTube. But that said, I know you have, as mentioned in the introductory material, many books, briefings, and of your kind of storied career and all of these writings and books. Is there one that you would recommend to every risk leader, or maybe an up and coming risk analyst, someone that's trying to get a handle on, how do I become better? How do I perfect my craft in this area?
Sure. The briefings are all obviously individually focused, and the books are all different. They all address different challenges, different sort of elements of risk, and I love them all, and I'm proud of them all. So choosing one is really hard. But if we're talking about leaders, I have got a nice book which is called Taming the Risk Hurricane, which is about preparing for business disruption The idea is to use the hurricane as a kind of metaphor. So, we monitor the hurricanes, we see them coming, we have our cone of uncertainty where it might go. We have a scale of hurricanes from sort of 1 to 5. We can track them, we can prepare for them, we can pre-position supplies, we can, when the thing hits, we can protect ourselves, we can repair afterwards. All of those things are metaphors for business disaster and a crisis. And so we can see a crisis coming, we can plot its direction, see where it might hit us, work out how bad it might be. We can pre-prepare, we can protect ourselves in the event, and we can clean up afterwards. All of those things I think are really useful for leaders. And what this book does is each chapter takes an element of the actual real hurricane and then translates that into the business setting in terms of preparing for major uncertainties in business. So I would love and it's quite sort of thin. It's 150 pages or something. It's not very expensive. Taming the Risk Hurricane would be my recommendation for leaders. And then more recently for risk specialists, there was a book which came out called the Risk Management Handbook, which I edited. So it's got 24 chapters, each written by a domain expert in technical risk, financial risk, reputation risk, country risk, political risk, big data risk, cyber risk, and so on, all of those things. And so that's a really good resource for risk specialists who want to kind of learn something about other types of risk that they might move into. But each of the books has its own focus. And on the Risk Doctor website, so it's riskdoctor.com with a hyphen, risk-doctor.com, you can find in the writing section details of all the books. But I don't really care about selling books. What I want to do is help people do the thing in practice. But maybe the books will help people get some ideas.
Yeah, I think they will. You mentioned of all the resources. There's lots of articles and magazines and videos, but I think the books have a level of depth, and even the analogy they use with the hurricane is just so apt, and it works so well that it may be hard to communicate that same kind of thing in another
Yeah.
area or another
That's why we write.
resource.
That's why we do it.
Yeah, yeah. I have a great appreciation for good analogy and learning through parable, and so anytime I hear a good one, I just think, man, I wish I came up with that because some of them are so good, and that's one of them where I'm like, man, that is just perfect. Thinking about even when you were talking about where we predict it's going, because there's an element of uncertainty, right? You can try
Course.
your best, and you could be wrong, and if you're wrong, then it could be disastrous, and if
Well,
you're right,
it's called the cone of uncertainty,
yep.
and it's narrow in the next two or 3 days. You know where the hurricane's going, but when you say where is it going to be in the next 3 days or 5 days, it's a much wider. The further out you go, the more uncertainty there is, and that's exactly true of our businesses and our projects. You can predict what's going to happen today. You know what's going to happen today, and probably tomorrow. Next week, maybe. Next year, no idea. And that is exactly what that cone of uncertainty for the hurricane is plotting. We can do the same for our businesses and our projects.
Yeah, I mean, just once again, jealous. That's a perfect, perfect analogy.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, we're getting toward the end of our time, and so I've got a couple questions that I think would be interesting for the audience. And I guess the first one is a risk myth you'd like to bust. So something that people believe that isn't true. We've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe there's a second one that is maybe not related to risk being downside only, but there's upside, but maybe there's another area that is uncovered that you consider a myth.
Yeah, I actually had a book called 10. I think it was the 10 worst risk myths or something. I
I
had a
love
book,
it.
a book idea, and I never published it. So maybe I should come to that. But actually, one of the briefings is called the top 10 risk myths. I just remembered. So you can find the briefings on the Risk Doctor website as well, and just Google myths, you'll find it. I think my biggest risk myth I'd like to bust right now is that the aim of risk management is to remove risk. It's not true. It's just not true. We're not trying to remove risk. We're not even trying to reduce risk. The aim of risk management is to help you take risk, to help you take the right risks and help you take the right risks safely. So we can't remove all risks. I mean, you would wrap yourself in cotton wool and stay at home. You're still in risk of of dying from starvation. You can't remove all the risks, so we have to take risk, but you want to take the right risks, not the stupid risks, not the risks that are going to lead you to disaster, not the risks that are going to overstretch you. So you take the right risks and you want to take those in the best possible way. So the aim of risk management is risk taking, not risk reduction or risk removal, but taking the right risks safely.
I like that because it's a completely different framing. Because when I talk to people about risk management, what they imagine is, yeah, risk transference. So someone who will come in, identify the risks, figure out if they can get insurance policies or bonds to reduce or remove the risk. But thinking about it more as, hey, what risks are ones we should take? And then how can we plan and prepare around it so that we can have the best possible outcome. It doesn't guarantee anything. It's still a
Mm.
world of probability, but we don't get the upside without taking some risk. And yeah, that being a myth that I think most of us believe. We imagine the risk manager as a guy with the clipboard and going around the office making sure no one's making a mistake that would bring big liability to the company. While that may be an aspect of it, it's not the overall focus of it, which is I think
Absolutely.
lost. So uh, next question is about a thinker or a book or a leader that maybe has shaped your approach and thinking. Or maybe one the most meaningful one, because I'm sure there are many philosophers and leaders and business folks who have shaped your thinking. But if there's one that really stands out or was kind of indelible early on in your journey, would be great to hear
Yeah, I
about.
mean, I love Herodotus, the Greek philosopher, but we won't talk about him. He was the inventor of history, but he came up with the concept of uncertainty. But I'd like to recommend to you somebody who got a job that I wanted. The University of Cambridge here in the UK founded a chair, a professorship for the public understanding of risk. And I really wanted that job, but it was an academic job and I wasn't really interested in that so much. I was, at the sharp end of doing things. And so a guy called Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, what a name.
That's a name.
He's the professor now. He's just retired, actually. He was knighted. He got a knighthood from the Queen for his work in helping people understand risk. And he has this great book called The Art of Uncertainty, How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk and Luck. The Art of Uncertainty by David Spiegelhalter. And he's my hero. He calls himself Professor Risk. I call myself the Risk Doctor. We're kind of in the same area. But he specializes in helping the public understand the risks that they're taking, whether it's to do with vaccines or medical research or using mobile phones and 5G masts and all sorts of things. Really, really interesting. So David Spiegelhalter is the thinker, and he's still alive. He's still, he's just retired, done some fabulous work, and got some good books and videos out there. And anything to do with his work, I'm right there. I'm interested.
Yeah, now I'm interested too. I'm gonna go check out his work, and that is a great name. And also, yeah, I like the parallel, the risk doctor. That was great. Thinking about how. Sorry, so the most important question board should ask about risk. So if you're maybe advising the board of a company, maybe an up and coming company, they're just getting into risk management. What is a question that that board should think about and make, and maybe it can be independent of industry, just like, hey, what should you look at?
Yep. I would recommend two questions. They're about awareness and action. So the first question that they need to be asking is, what do I need to know that I don't currently know? And the second question is, what do I need to be doing that I'm not currently doing? And those two questions, what do I need to know? What do I need to do that I'm not currently knowing or doing? Awareness and action are the key things for for board managers, for organizational leaders, well, really right across the board, across the whole organization, to help them think about the things they don't know that they need to know. Those are the risks, the things, the uncertainties which are not currently on their radar, and which are the ones that are important. And as a result of knowing that, then what should we be doing? So in terms of actually our strategy and our way forward and managing those uncertainties. So what do I need to know that I don't currently know? What should I be doing that I'm not currently doing? And if you can ask those questions and get people around you who can help you to answer them, then your life will be an awful lot easier.
Yeah, two really good questions that I think would take quite a while to answer, but it would reveal what that board should focus on and help the governors of that organization really push toward. So that I think those are great Great questions. Earlier in the podcast, you talked about some emerging areas of risk, whether those be artificial intelligence or existential risk. Is there an area that has you intrigued, or like one that you maybe want to focus your effort on, or maybe write a book on in the future? Maybe an emerging area of risk that interests you.
Well, I am interested in those two that you mentioned,
Mhm.
existential risk, because that is, the existence of humanity, and then behind that, I think artificial intelligence, climate change, biosecurity, all of those things are existential risks, and if they combine, then we're really in trouble. So I think that that does interest me, but I'm also interested at at a completely different sort of level of scale in risks of parenting. You mentioned you have a couple of children. My grandchildren are the same age as your children, which just goes to show which end of life I'm at. I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old grandchildren, and the risks of parenting is hugely uncertain, and it really, really matters. And there are lots of bad things that could happen, and lots of fabulous opportunities. And to navigate that, I'm really interested in seeing how risk-based approach, risk-based thinking, can help you bring your children up in the best possible way and just let them fly.
Yeah, that's an area that interests me as well, being in the kind of real crux of my parenthood, and then also the other ones that you mentioned and the intersection of them. So we're going through a time where artificial intelligence is doing more and more. I think part of this, transcript will probably be generated by artificial intelligence, and there will be many touch points that both of us will have over just today with large language models. The climate change and the climate risk is also one that is top of mind, right? We're living in a climate that is unpredictable, and there's lots of natural disasters, and for those who work in risk, especially in insurable risk, and how to underwrite, right, the damages that can happen to homes and to life, and
But
it's
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 not
an
just the
area, it's hard.
climate which is uncertain, it's
Yeah,
also the science is uncertain,
the
and
sciences, yeah.
the analysis is uncertain, and the way that we interpret the analysis, and therefore what we do. So the source data is uncertain, but the whole piece is uncertain. And I think when those uncertainties interact together, we really need some clear thinking to see our way through it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have this question, but as you spoke, it really just came to mind of how, well, with all this intersection of uncertainty and no real locus of calculation to think about, okay, what steps should we take to mitigate this risk, or what advantages can we get by doing one thing versus another? When we're thinking about policy and how to approach this problem, are there any frameworks that leaders can work with all this uncertainty and trying to make these huge decisions that will affect not only us today, maybe the existence of our species?
Absolutely. And there are specialists in this area. And one of the chapters in the risk management handbook that I mentioned is on climate change risk, written by somebody who's a real global expert in the field. And you can be sure that the risk guys like me are really working in this area and advising the decision makers. So that's all happening. But if you want a framework to help you think about climate change, use the 7 questions. It's exactly those simple 7 questions apply when we're talking about the existence of humanity, down to how I bring up my kids and how I run my project or keep my business growing in between. Everything can be solved by the simple 7 question framework. What am I trying to do? What could affect me? If we're thinking about existence of humanity, what could affect that? Which are the big ones? What are we going to do? And then we do that and we ask if it worked and then how things have changed and we communicate. It's exactly the same framework, just applied in different ways.
Yeah, that's and the 7 questions. I've got to spend some more time thinking about our processes that way a little bit. And as someone who's helping your companies do risk registers and think about risk appetite and think about how they can track their risks relative to current events and geopolitical events, having this conversation and being able to think from first principles and really some grounded thinking has been really enlightening. So I thank you for coming on and being willing to do this. And you mentioned a couple times your website. Is that the best place for listeners to find your work, or are there any other places that you'd like to direct them to?
The website is a good starting point. So it's risk-doctor.com. There is another risk doctor without the hyphen, but he's a friend of mine. And if you go to him, he's an options trader in
Uh,
Chicago. And so if you go to his website, he'll redirect you. But if you want to come to me directly, risk-doctor.com. But the best place for learning would be my YouTube channel, which is called Risk Doctor Video, all in one word, Risk Doctor Video. But, just Google me and you'll find these things. There's, I think, a couple of hundred videos in various playlists on the YouTube channel, and that's a great place to start.
Perfect. And thank you again. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Industrial Risk Beyond the Blueprint. Dr. Hillson has shown us today the fundamentals of effective risk management, whether it's the 7 questions approach or his tips on effective risk communication. There's plenty here for everyone, from operations leaders and safety professionals to you and I, to put into action. If you found the value in today's conversation, tell a colleague, leave a review, and don't forget to check out Dr. Hillson's work at his website and his YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jowanza Joseph, and this is Industrial Risk Beyond the Blueprint. Thanks for listening, and stay safe.